means, as you just saw, I can visually say, these are the ones that I want. So this allows me to take multiple files. Let's pretend these are all PSD files, which they obviously aren't, but we'll just pretend for the sake of argument they are. And then I go to Tools, in Bridge, by the way, Photoshop, Image Processor. Then it jumps back to Photoshop and it says, okay, you've chosen 5 images in Bridge. Where would you like to save them? Now you have the option of putting them into a different folder completely, which frankly I would normally think of doing, except in this case, because if I choose save in the same location, it will actually automatically create a new folder, so I don't have to worry about overwriting any files. So this is what it would normally look like. You've got the option of saving as a JPEG, save as a PSD, or save as TIFF. Now, saving as JPEG is automatically going to flatten the other ones if there are layers that will preserve it. So in here, I've got the option to say save as a JPEG, pick the quality setting for quality of JPEG, and also have the option of resizing to fit. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that I'm doing this to be able to post some images to Facebook or something like that. I would choose resize to fit, and then it gives me a measurement for width and height. Now, imagine this says resize the longest measurement or the longest side to. So that means if it's a wide image, it'll be 1,000 pixels. If it's a tall image, the height will be 1,000 pixels. This does not mean it will resize to a square. So just for the sake of argument, let's put these both to 900 pixels. And later on, we'll talk about actions. If we had something set up, we could run that as well. But the thing I love, I'll tell you right now, the thing I love about Image Processor is its simplicity. It doesn't make me do a lot of things. I don't have to record any steps or build anything, or it's really just open these files, save them as this file format. Simple. So I hit the Run button, and it goes through and flashes through and goes, here's that one, here's that one, here's that one. And eventually, down at the bottom, I now have a new folder that wasn't there before called JPEG. So if I look inside of it, well, now there's only 2. Now I did pick 5 files, but I'm sure that happened because some of them were already JPEGs, and I probably went, what are you doing resaving a JPEG? So normally I'd use this with either a bunch of PSD files or a bunch of RAW files or whatever it is, and say all of these I want saved at this size. And of course now you'll see it's no longer a layered file, it's flattened one. But I previously saved my PSD version of it. So Image Processor is a very nice way to be able to say, I need to create a bunch of files, copies that are flattened in some other format. I use it all the time when, again, I've done a project with many PSD files. I'll wait till the end. So here's a typical scenario. I do a photo shoot. It's got a bunch of RAW files in it. I go through and say, these are the RAW files I want to work on. I work on them as PSD files and save them that way. So then in the same folder, I have RAW files and PSD files. One of the advantages of Bridge is I can look inside a folder and say, show me only the whatever. So in this case, I could say, show me only the Photoshop files, and then I could select those and use Image Processor. So it's a very nice way if you have a whole folder full of images like that scenario I just mentioned, where I have a bunch of RAW files and then a bunch of PSD that are my master files. All I want to save as a JPEG is those PSDs. So I'd go into that filter option in Bridge, say show me only the Photoshop files, select them all, and then go Image Processor. So then in that same folder I have RAW files, PSD master files, and my final JPEG version. So that's kind of the workflow that I would suggest. So here we are back in Bridge, and we have this Illustrator file. Now if I double clicked on it, it would open in Illustrator. I want to open it in Photoshop. Well, instead of going to Photoshop and choosing File Open, I can force the issue by right or control clicking and telling it to open with Photoshop. So that's another way we didn't talk about before, but that's just came at this point. So this allows me to take that Illustrator file and force it to open in Illustrator. It's still going to do that preliminary, let me decide how big I want it to be kind of thing. So we'll just make it, doesn't have to be very big for purposes. I hit open. So as we saw before, it opens with this transparent background happening. At this point, I want to make sure this is ready to use on a website, so I'm going to make sure it's RGB. and then I also want to save it as a PNG file. Now, when it comes to creating things for an on-screen use using formats like PNG, we have a couple of options here. The first one will just be a simple save as, and then choose the file format to PNG. Now, because this is on a transparent background, it will be saved with a transparent background. So that's one of the advantages of PNG over JPEG, is you can save transparency. The only kind of catch to it is you have to make sure that it's the right size in Photoshop. So we'd have to look at our image size command, which we'll go into more detail very soon, and make sure it's the right size, and then I could save as PNG. But let's imagine for a moment, let's go back a step here. Let's say I opened it, forced it to open in Photoshop, but it was considerably bigger than I need. And I'm going to make sure in this case it's RGB. And now I decide I need a PNG file, but it needs to be smaller than this. This is where we could use Save for Web. Now, this command is called Save for Web. I would almost consider it Save for Web brackets or any on-screen use, because really that's its real strength, is preparing something to be used in an on-screen kind of a situation. So here it is, here's Save for Web, and this is where I can pick different options. I'm going to say make it a PNG. As soon as you do, it shows me there's the transparency, but then the other advantages in here, I can say, but I'd like it to be 50% of this size. So now it's going to automatically resize it down and show me the results. And there's all kinds of other settings I'm not going to go into here, but this means we can save in these web formats, GIF, JPEG, PNG, etc. Pick the one that's recommended by whoever you're doing it with. But the other nice thing is from within Save for Web, we have one other option here, and that is I can preview it in a browser. So here's Safari, and it's saying there's what it would look like, and here's all the information in terms of the HTML code for it. So what this allows me to do is say, what if I made it even smaller, and hit preview, so you can kind of see it's looking still pretty good. So it's a really nice way without, I haven't actually saved it yet. So Save for Web has these nice options, including the ability to save it or preview it in various browsers. By default, it'll go to whatever one you have open or as your default, I guess. All kinds of options in here, and it has presets. So if you know there's a setting you use on a regular basis, you can do that here. Now, you'll also notice it has JPEG, high quality, and all that kind of stuff. The reason for using this is you might have, let's actually open our, where is it? This one? Well, we'll go with that. So here's a layered document, and I want to make it a JPEG. Instead of just simply choosing Save As in here and hoping I like the way it looks, I always also have the option of doing Save for Web. And here we can look at it and see JPEG, but you can see here, here's all the presets, like JPEG low quality. What does that really mean in terms of how it's going to look? Well, let's see. I preview it. It looks okay. It's a little low quality. So let's compare that with the preset that says JPEG high. Now JPEG high means a quality of 60, which is not maximum. So preview that. It's a little better. Let's go maximum quality. Because these days, even at maximum quality, it's still going to, I mean, honestly, if people are using a 56K modem and it's going to take 37 seconds to load, then, well, yeah. It's also a fairly large file. So again, I could say, well, I need this to be 600 pixels high at JPEG maximum, and hit preview. That looks pretty good, and it's giving me, again, all the information. So Save for Web is the place where if we need to be able to go in and say, I need a bit more information, or I need to preview it, and it has the added bonus where you can save presets in different combinations. So again, this is, I want to stress, is it's called Save for Web, and that's, of course, is one of its main purposes. But even if you're thinking, I just want to save a JPEG to post on my Facebook page, you might want to consider using this just to get an idea of the settings to use. Once you've done that, then you may end up going and just choosing Save As in Photoshop or using Image Processor. But either way, this just gives us more of a preview. The other one is more of a batch kind of a thing. And again, there's plenty of options in here. You can even compare, if you want, multiple versions. So you could go in and say, for example, here it's saying, here's JPEG 100, JPEG 50, and JPEG 25. And you can see a very detailed comparison between them. Let's put it up to 80%. So you can see it's pretty subtle. I mean, I can see it mostly in some of these edges between the original that was really quite large for, it'd be too large for a web page, 1.6 megabytes. Now I'm getting it down to pretty small sizes, and the quality is pretty decent. So that's where Save for Web kind of comes into play more, is for this kind of purpose. Okay? So when we're getting things out of Photoshop, saving is obviously a big part of it. We also, there's things that we may or may not talk about. For example, you have the ability to export just parts of Photoshop. Like if you're working with Illustrator, you can export a path. So if you look under the File menu here and you see export commands that say things like paths to Illustrator and render video, those are very specific functions based on other options. Now, if you are a Creative Cloud member, the other thing that's kind of nice is that there's now a nice simple way that if you decide that I worked on some project and I want to share this work, especially to get some feedback. Maybe you're like me, you work as an individual, you don't have other people in your office to just show your work and say, give me some thoughts on this. Behance is one of the aspects of Creative Cloud that's kind of nice, and built into Photoshop CC is the ability to share on Behance. Now what it's doing, remember this is a PSD file, so it's going to go through and it's going to, when it says preparing your image, it's actually doing that save kind of save for web function and making it a preview that I can work with. So I can call it test of an idea. Tag it with something. You have to have at least one tag in here. If I could spell. And I'm calling this new work, and I hit continue. Then I can pick kind of a preview image to say this is what I want people to see, and then hit crop, cover, and publish. Now I'm not actually going to, because I've done this before and people would wonder, why does he keep sharing the same thing over and over again? So let's close out of here, but I'll show you what it would look like in my Creative Cloud. If I look at my work, you can see that somewhere in here, I'll just go and pick one of them, but here's a bunch of things that I previously done. If we do work in progress, which is where I often upload something, for example, this one, I uploaded and got some people that were commenting and giving suggestion. So although Behance is exclusive to Creative Cloud, it is a nice way to share your work directly out of here. So let's look quickly at Photoshop again. We've got Save for saving our PSD files. We have Save As to get things out there, and also Save for Web. Now, later on, we'll talk about automating Photoshop, including things like actions, and one of the things we could do is build our own actions, and as one of the steps would include a save option. So then we could also do a batch process where we say, take all these images, run this particular process, and save it in a separate folder. So Image Processor is a script that simply says, I will take whatever you give me and save it in whatever size and format you tell me. The batch processing using actions takes a little step further, but it requires some input on your side. Now, the other part of Photoshop in terms of getting files out, of course, is printing. And this is by no means intended to be an in-depth discussion on printing, because there could probably be a whole class on printing. But there are a couple things that I want to mention right up front, and these are based on comments that I get from people all the time. And that is when I make my big case for saying don't ever flatten or merge, often the response is, but I thought I had to in order to print. And the answer is absolutely not. You could, but there's no reason to. Photoshop prints whatever is visible. So really, there's no compelling reason to flatten everything unless, well, even to say unless, later on, I can't really get into it right now, but the main reason people say they need to flatten is they want to sharpen the whole thing before they go to print. But as you'll see later on in a future class, a future session, we'll talk about how you could even get around that. But the bottom line is, if I want to print this, I don't have to do anything except File and then Print. And that brings up the print dialog box, which is where I can pick the printer and do all these settings and decide on the size. But you'll see, I didn't have to do anything. I'd have to flatten it, saying, well, since these are the layers that are showing, these are the ones that will print. Now again, I'm not going to go into all the settings for printing and all these kind of things, but it is also possible, you can reposition it in this preview, but let's say we had a really huge file and we didn't want to waste a whole bunch of printing ink yet, so one of the options would be to make a small selection of a portion of your image, and then when you hit print, one of the options further down is print the selected area. So now it's only going to print the part that you've selected, so you can kind of do a quick test print to make sure the settings are okay and the way you've adjusted it and the brightness and everything else is good before you do a complete test print. So again, that's just one small thing I wanted to show you. And the main reason I did that is because a lot of people miss that, and it's actually quite useful. Otherwise, of course, there is a whole world of color management, of let the printer manage the colors versus Photoshop. And again, that's way beyond the scope of our discussion in this overall 30 days of Photoshop. That's something you probably want to look up and see what the experts have to say about that. But the main thing I wanted to stress is that please don't get caught in the trap of assuming you have to flatten before printing, because almost all the time you don't. And even if you think you do, there's a good chance you could do it using this Smart Object Smart Filter method that we'll talk about in a future class. So since this was a class really just about getting things in and out of Photoshop, good news, you don't have any actual assignment to do today except, well, open a few files and just try some of the different ways for getting files in. Maybe if you have a folder full of PSD files or RAW files, try Image Processor to see how quickly it works to export a bunch of things. But basically just real easy one for you. Explore some of the different ways you can get files in and out of Photoshop. And we'll see you tomorrow. Welcome back. Today is a very important topic because it's something we do all the time in Photoshop, and this is one of these things where if you start on the wrong foot, it kind of sets the tone for everything and makes life a lot more difficult. And we're talking about image size and resolution and file size and resizing and all those kinds of things. Now, in the original days of Photoshop, we only really worried about printing because that's what we did with Photoshop, is we scanned things in and thought about what resolution to scan and how many dots per inch we were going to print out. And then individual inkjet printers came along, and that changed things slightly. And then we had on-screen things like PowerPoint, and finally we have the web, which changes things completely again. So times have changed a little bit, and it really changes the importance of how we decide on things like how big a file do we need. And the first thing we need to talk about is just one of my favorite expressions in Photoshop is always thinking backwards. So if you're starting on a project where you're creating something, whatever it might be, and you're trying to decide how big should I make this, well, you need to think backwards from the end result. So for example, if you know that you're printing it as a magazine cover in a traditional go out to a printing press kind of environment, that's going to need a fairly large size to be able to do that, as opposed to video or a slideshow like PowerPoint or web design. Now, if there's even the remotest possibility that you need to create something for multiple purposes, then without any question, start with the biggest size you possibly could need. One of the standard rules of Photoshop is you can always size something down without losing any quality, unless you're sizing a huge amount down, and you'll notice a slight difference, but there's a big difference between that and taking something that's small and making it bigger. So if the only version of something you have is like a PSD file of a logo that's this big, the chances are you're not going to be able to enlarge it up to a magazine size without being pretty unhappy about the quality. So that suggests that when you're capturing the image, we need to be also conscious of that. And what I mean by that is if you're the one taking the photographs, then shoot at the highest quality you can on your camera. So whether that's super high JPEG or RAW, the largest file you can, bigger is better in this case. Not ultimately if all you're going to use it for is on the web in a small size, but again, if you know there's even a small possibility of needing something larger, it's always best to start large and make it smaller. Higher the resolution, of course, the bigger the file size will be, which just means everything takes up more room and takes longer and so on. If you're printing to your own inkjet printer, then you basically have to establish what is a good number for your printer. The thing that throws people off with inkjet printers, and even to some degree laser printers, is the printer itself will be labeled to say this is a 600 DPI printer or a 1440 DPI or a 2880 DPI or something like that. And really, that's just describing the technology behind the printer. That really doesn't help us in any way to determine what kind of quality to use from a resolution standpoint, because in Photoshop we talk pixels per inch, not dots per inch. So dots per inch is the output device, pixels per inch is the number that we're going to use to try and get the best quality from that output device. So if you're sending out to a commercial printer, use whatever they tell you. If they say we need 300 DPI, then send them 300 DPI if you can, or whatever the closest you can get to that. And we'll see later exactly what I mean by the closest you can get. If it's your own inkjet printer, then my suggestion is the best thing you can do is just do a quick test. Take a typical photograph with some nice detail in it, and on the same page we're going to print out multiple images and also maybe print separate versions. So for example, you might send one to your inkjet that's 300 pixels per inch and then 250 and then 200 and then 150, and look at them and find out, compare, and I think you'll find that there's not a huge difference. In fact, for many people between 200 pixels per inch and 300, it's almost imperceivable. Most people, I think, come up with a number or a range of numbers that they feel comfortable using on their inkjet. For example, based on past trial and error, I use 240 pixels per inch as my kind of target number, which would be ideal. But in a pinch, if the best I can get with what I'm starting with is 200 or even a little less, it's still okay. It still prints fine. One of the things that surprises people to know is when, for example, you see a trade show booth and you're looking at it from far away, the resolution of that original file that was printed could have been as low as 80, 50 pixels per inch because you're not looking at it this close, you're looking at it from afar. So that also makes a difference. But again, just to clarify, if you're sending out to some commercial printing press, and I'm not talking about labs that do one-off kind of prints, we'll talk about in a second, but printing press, see what it says on their website. There are lots of places, for example, where you can print business cards or postcards, and they usually have a page that says, send us this size of file, or in some cases, in many cases, in fact, they actually have a template you can download as a PSD file that already has the right size and resolution and even has some guides as to where to put things. Now, if you're sending out to a lab to get prints done where you're just getting prints or canvas or printing on metal, then I would use the same concept, look on their website and see what they say in terms of, ideally, we need this size in terms of it to be able to get the quality we need. So we'll say if you want a 13 by 19 print, send it to us in this size. Now, don't be surprised if some of those labs just tell you the pixel dimension. Sometimes they'll just say, we need a file that's 3,000 pixels by 4,000 pixels. And then resolution doesn't even enter into it, because that's the other way to think about the size and quality of a file, is the image in terms of pixel dimensions. And we'll look at that as we go. So if you're the one capturing and you capture large, you can always bring it down, and we can use Photoshop to kind of help us figure out how much information we need. Let's take a look at what I'm talking about here. So here's an image. This is a stock photo that I grabbed from somewhere, and it's a particular size. I've opened it in Photoshop, and I used the command that says fit on screen, and at the top it says 62.1%. That means it's been scaled down to, I'm looking at it at 60-ish% of its original size. Well, what does that really mean for me? Well, one of the things that it means is I need to find out how much information do I really have to work with. And the command we'll spend the most of our time with in here is image size. Now, in previous versions of Photoshop, before CC, you wouldn't see this preview, you would just see the numbers. So the numbers still work the same way. If you have Photoshop CC, we have the added bonus of a preview area, which can give us some feedback, and this dialog box can be made much larger. I'm going to keep it fairly small so it looks more like previous versions of Photoshop for those of you who do not have Photoshop CC. So for the most part, it's going to look a little bit different in earlier versions, but the concept is still the same. So when I go to image size, a couple of things are happening here. It's telling me the size of this image in terms of file size is 3.74 megabytes. Its dimensions, it's 1400 pixels by 933, and that is confirmed down here. Now, if I decide that I want to make it smaller, maybe that's too big for a website, I simply want to say, no, I've determined that the size I need is 1024. I type in that size, and it does the math and says, well, the height will be this, and now you'll see my image size has decreased from 3.74 to 2 megabytes, which frankly is still pretty big for a web graphic, but then on top of that we would save as a JPEG with different compression and so on. But for now, the biggest thing is this is just allowing me to say resize it down. So if that's all I want to do, I'd click OK, and now if I do fit in window again, you'll see I'm seeing a little closer to the original size because it's now a smaller pixel dimension. Based on my viewing area, that's what I'm going to get. For a while, this command was gone, and it was brought back in, and I apologize, I can't remember now if it was either CS6 or CC. I think it might have been CC, but print size means how, if I was to print this, how big would it print? And that will become more useful when we look at some other examples. If I look at 100% size, that just means make sure that this number up here says 100, but then I won't be able to see the entire photograph on my screen. So as we've talked about in previous lessons, I very often find myself switching between fit on screen so I can see the entire image to get an idea of where things are, but whenever I'm making decisions about the quality of things and things of that nature, then I'm going to look at it at 100% size just to make sure that I'm not being misled by screen quality. Because whenever you're looking at things on screen like this, or in this fit in screen view, sometimes the quality suffers just a little bit. So again, the first thing to keep in mind is everything we do here is determined by what we're starting with. So if I have, for example, a camera raw file, and open that in RAW, let's first of all take off this quality. So this is saying that the way this image was captured was with a 5.1 megapixel camera. If I click OK, just adjust a little bit and then open it, and then go to image size, and I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut Command Option I or Control Alt I. It's telling me, well, this is a bigger file. It's 14.7 megabytes, and it's 2784 by 1880. Sorry, I can't even read, 1848 pixels. And again, I could change that. So how does this factor in when, for example, I want to send this out somewhere as a print? Well, one of the things we can do is use the new dialog box as kind of a calculator. So if I do new file and I say, okay, I want a 10 by 8 at 300, because that's the quality that my printer has determined, it's telling me I need a file of 20.6 megabytes. So let's click OK and do a bit of comparison. Let's see what we've got when we look at image size for this one. It's saying it's 3000 by 2400 at 20.6 megabytes. If I look at the photo that I want to use, it's too small. First of all, right from looking at the image size, I can see that I really need 20 megabytes worth of information, and I've got 14, and I need considerably higher pixel dimensions, and I only have a smaller one. So just to clarify that, if I were to take this image and compare it on the screen, if they're both in fit and window view, they both kind of look similar, but the little giveaway is, look up at the top here, it's saying this one is at 31% and this is at 24%. So that's giving me a pretty good hint that if I copy this over to here, it's not going to be big enough. Now, the question that comes up at this point, could I physically use free transform and scale this up to fit? And the answer is I could, but I'm going to lose a bit of quality. How much quality? Well, it depends how much you're scaling it up, but even if you only scale it up a little bit, you are going to lose some quality. Now, I've heard people say things like, as long as you're scaling it less than 10%, you're not going to lose quality, and technically that's not true. What they probably should be saying is, if you're scaling it just a little bit, the change in quality will be less obvious, but there will be some loss of quality because we're forcing Photoshop to say, it was this big, I need you to make it bigger, and kind of invent some pixel information here and there to make it look good. So if I came back here and free transformed this up to fill up the image, it doesn't look horrible, it's not bad, but it's not quite as sharp, it's not going to print quite as nicely. And again, depending what it is, that may be okay. But this concept of using the new dialog box as kind of a calculator to say, well, if I want to print this big, how much information do I need? Now, as I mentioned, some labs are now giving it just in pixel information. So they're just saying, if we change to pixels, they're saying as long as you give us a file that's 3000 by 2400 pixels, this number really has nothing to do with it. Look what happens here. I've got 3000 pixels by 2400 pixels, and it says image size is 20.6 megabytes. If I change this resolution down to 72, it's still 20.6 megabytes, because what we're doing is saying, I want this much pixel information. The resolution just means how big will it print in terms of quality, but it's still this much information, so that the resolution number when you're looking at pixel dimensions really has less of an influence than people think. So just to show you the difference, let's open this one, make a new document, and then make another new document, and in this case go to 300. And so let's look at the two of them. So here's the first one I created and the second one. When we go to image size, and again I'm using that shortcut if I didn't mention it before, Command-Option-I or Control-Alt-I for image size, still saying 20.6 megabytes, 3000 by 2400. If I look at the other one, use the same thing, it's still exactly the same. So what is the difference? Well, the only real difference, and it's going to be tough to see here, but if I go to print size, there's going to be a slight difference between them. That one would appear to print bigger because when the resolution's smaller, it means physically it will print larger on a page. But as I mentioned before, the main reason for using this kind of method of measuring file size is when a company like a lab says, as long as you send us 3000 by 2400 pixels, that's all I need. It doesn't matter to them whether it's 300 or 72 or 150, they'll do that math in their facility because you've given them enough pixel information to work with. So I would say more and more companies are starting to use pixel dimension and or file size. They say, as long as you send me 20 megabytes worth of information, that's fine. Or they'll say, again, as long as it's 3000 by 2400 pixels, that's enough. And you'll still see some places, more likely in the traditional printing press, where they'll say, yeah, no, I need a 8 by 10 at 300 or whatever the numbers are, and they'll use the dots per inch resolution as their method of measurement. So it really is just different ways of describing the same thing. The key thing for us to remember is we need to make sure we have more than enough, not too little. So if the math says, if that little new document calculator says I need 20 megabytes worth of information and the best I have is 5 megabytes, it's not going to print very well, or I'm not going to be able to fulfill the size that I need. So that's why right at the top I said, if you have the control over it, which hopefully most of you do, and you're capturing photographs, capture the biggest size you can. The price you're going to have to pay is storage space. But again, I'd happily have to go and buy another hard drive to give myself more options. Let's put it this way. I would hate for this to happen where you think, okay, well, I'm just taking a bunch of photos that are going to be on a website. So you switch your camera to medium quality JPEG, which in effect means all my images are a maximum of this big. And then as you're taking the photograph, you get that killer shot that you love so much, and maybe the school you're shooting for says, we'd love to make it into a poster, and you're like, yeah, no, it's this big. That would be really, really sad. But it can happen because, again, you can't force resolution to be, or file size to be bigger without paying some price. In this case, the price is lower quality. So it's something to be aware of. Now let's go back and look at some more examples of working with image size here. So I'm going to open up these two files. Here's another example where on the screen it looks like pretty much the same thing, because I've said open these two and change the view to fit on screen. But the couple of clues that you'll notice here, again, look at the size up here, 72.4% versus 11%. So the smaller the number is here, that means the bigger the file size it is, because it's so big that it has to scale it down dramatically to fit on the screen. So here's where we could start to see the difference. I want to work on this photograph to do some portrait retouching, for example. So I press Command or Control 1 for 100%, and that's the largest I can get. So if I wanted to work on her eyes or her teeth or anything else, there's not a lot of work that needs to be done here on this photo of Lauren. But now I'm at 200%, now I'm at 300%, now I'm at 400%. You'll see it's pretty tough to make realistic decisions about anything here, because as I zoom in further, it becomes more and more pixelized because I'm pushing it past the point of size that makes any sense. So let's look at the image size just to clarify. This is a small file. It's 1.2 megabytes. It's 530 by 800, which, by the way, would look fantastic on Facebook, but when I'm trying to zoom in to do further work, it's not giving me a lot of room to play. Compare that with this one, and I'm going to press Command and Control 1 for 100%. Wow, look at the difference. Because the quality of this image is so much higher, its version of 100% means I can zoom in really, really close and see very high quality and make all kinds of decisions. So let's try to make her teeth look the same size. And you see I can't even do it, and I start to see this little pixel grid. So I'm at 600%, and I've got this pixel grid showing this one. I'm at 100%, everything's sharp and crisp and clear. So here's the next point that's important to make. Maybe you want only an image that's going to be on Facebook, so having a height of 800 pixels is more than enough. But initially, when you're working on the file, I would much rather have this kind of quality. I'd rather be able to go in and say, yes, I can zoom in close, so now I'm making more accurate decisions about things. And then once I'm finished, and we, as we talked about in another session, have our master file that's this big, now along with saving as a JPEG to take away any layers and make it that flattened version for Facebook, I would also be going in and making another version of that which is smaller yet. So I'm going to have my master file PSD, which is my full size with all the layers. I'm going to save a flattened version, which is JPEG, which is still going to be quite large, larger than I need for something like Facebook or any online use. So I will take that and use image size to make it smaller yet. Now, there's one danger, and I hold my hand up as saying that person, I used to be guilty of this all the time. Because I could, when I first got a really good scanner and I would scan in photographs, this is before the days of digital photography, I would scan it in a really high resolution and I would zoom in and I would see someone's eye this big on my screen. And I'd be zoomed in all the way, and I'd take a tool and start removing little bits of red, you know, in their eye, and I would start tweaking this, and I'd start painting eyelashes, and I'd spend way too much time zoomed in that close, because that won't happen is when I printed it, their eye that I'm seeing this big on the screen is this big on the print. And I realized no one else except me could see that because I was zoomed in so close because I could be that zoomed in that close in Photoshop that I was artificially seeing everything really big. Now, if you know you're going to print a poster where it will be big, that's fine. But again, if you're ultimately going to say this is someone's headshot that they're going to print this big or use on their website this big, you don't want to go overboard with zooming in so close and obsessing over every little detail. So here's a little trick that I use all the time that I think you might want to take a look at. I'm going to close the smaller one for now. So here's this large one. And again, it is a large file. It's 46 megabytes, way larger than I'll probably already need, or that I'll probably need at any point. But here I'm still going to work on this one because it gives me the opportunity to do that nice zoom in and work. But I don't want to kill myself by having it, you know, zoomed in so far like I just described that I'm being distracted. So one method that works really nicely, and it tends to work best if this is the only file you have open, it doesn't have to be, but it works best this way, is you go to the window menu, and under Arrange, you'll see there's a command that says New Window 4, and then it'll say the name of your file. Now this is not duplicating the image, it's making a second view in a second window of the same image. So we do that, and then we go back to Arrange, and then there's a command called Tile. So I'm going to change it to 2 up vertical, which just means they'll go side by side. So what you do is on one of them, let's pick this one. This one I'm going to zoom in really close to start working on her teeth, but the one on the right I'm going to keep closer to, let's say we're going to use it on Facebook and it will be around this size. Then I'm going to change my view so that every change I make on the zoomed in view, it will reflect over here. Now, not that you would ever do this, but I want you to be able to see what I'm doing. If I, on this image, take my paintbrush and I have a small little brush, and obviously you wouldn't paint with black on a tooth, but just to make a point, I make that very obvious change there. You can barely see it over here. And imagine, obviously, we wouldn't paint with black, we would be lightening or adjusting, and that's kind of the point, is that if you're spending all your time looking at this incredibly large zoomed-in view, you may be tempted to make all kinds of little changes that you can't even see at this smaller size. So, for example, I've seen people looking around and they're like, oh, there's a little tiny, and they start worrying about tiny little blemishes in the skin texture that you really, frankly, will not see. So you have to kind of train yourself to say, okay, I'm going to look at her eye, but is there anything really obvious? You know, little small lines. I mean, yes, I could go in and adjust all of those, but are you really going to see them over here? So this method, what it allows you to do is we're, again, creating a second view, not duplicating the document, that's really important. Second view of the same document. One, we zoom in to a working view we want, but we keep the second view in a more reasonable size, and it basically helps us keep things in context. So we're not, again, wasting all this time adjusting little tiny details that the human eye can't even detect. So once you're finished, then you close one or the other of them, and you'll end up with just the one file, and then you'll save this one. So let's imagine for a moment that I have worked on this, and I have a couple of retouching layers. We'll talk in a later class about how I would actually do this kind of thing. And we'll say that I'm going to save this as the master file, which is our PSD file, with layers, everything else as is. So that's my master file. Now I want to do that idea of going save as, and we're going to call this, let's give it some other name so I don't overwrite the one that's already there. Now at first, all this is going to do is remove the layers. So if I open that file, you see the only real difference is our original file is 86 megabytes because we have the layers in there. The JPEG version is considerably smaller, but it's still quite large. So I open that one, and then go to my image size command, and again, we're still really big. So this comes to our next part, is how do we resize something down? If it is too big, how do I tell it I want it to be smaller? And here is where we choose both, do we want to resample or not, and how do we want to resample? So here are the options that are available to you. If you just set it on automatic, that's actually not a bad choice at all, because that means it will use the method of resampling depending on whether you're getting smaller or larger. If you know very specifically, for example, in this case, I know I'm going to get smaller, I'm going to reduce the size, then I could choose bicubic sharper. Again, there's let's put it this way, the last two versions of Photoshop CS6 and CC, do automatic is new. It wasn't there before. You had to always choose the setting, whether you want to go bigger or smaller. So if you have an older version of Photoshop, you have to go in and pick one of them. If you have automatic as an option, that's fine to use. So I'm going to put it on automatic. It's 46 megabytes. This is my JPEG version, remember, and I say, well, all I really need is 900 pixels per inch for Facebook or whatever it is. Now, this is new in CC, which is very nice, which is a preview. So you can see it still looks very nice. I'm not losing any kind of quality, but the file size has gone down dramatically. Now it's gone from 46 megabytes to 1.53 megabytes and telling me it's now this size. This Photoshop CC has a nice, interesting menu too, where if you need to, you can create some specific size, so you know that you're always resizing something to fit a particular dimensions. You can pick from one of these or create your own preset for that. So when we click OK, the main thing that happens is it looks much smaller on the screen because now it is a smaller dimension. If I go back to image size, now it's that size. And once again, I would now be saving this as some other name, so I know. Now, you may not need to do that. I mean, this is a personal preference, because if you have that master PSD file, when you save that first JPEG, you may decide, I don't need to keep two of them. So this part's up to you. I'm going to suggest in this particular scenario, I want to keep a large and make another smaller one this size. So now that I've resized this one down, I'll name this file and save it. Oops, I gotta pick a different name apparently. There we go. So now when we go to look, we see we have, there's that file, it's only 396K. So we've gone from 86 megabyte with our original layered Photoshop file down to a 396K file that's going to load and display much more quickly. Now, to be honest about this, worrying about file size for web type stuff is a lot less of a worry than it was years ago, because in the early days of the web, in fact, I still remember having a discussion with someone, and keep in mind, I was coming from the print world where we were worried about files being like 100 megabytes, for print, and a small file would have been 20 megabytes, and I remember sitting in my first session discussing with a graphic designer this new thing called the web, and at that point, because everyone was on dial-up modems, they said, yeah, well, it's got to be a pretty small file, like, say, 8K. And I remember thinking he must have misspoken, he meant 8 megabytes. But no, he meant an 8K. So imagine trying to take a photo that by nature was this big and 20 megabytes and somehow make it 8K. So all I can say is, thankfully, we don't have to worry about that anymore, because with today's internet and cable access and everything else, file size is nowhere near as important. Obviously, we still want it to be smaller rather than overly large, but at the same time, it's less of a concern than it used to be. But this scenario is fairly typical. You open the file as big as you can based on how it was captured. You do your work on that one, keeping in mind, though, that we don't want to mislead ourselves by zooming in too far and working on details that the human eye can't even see. But keep that big master file, do that, maybe that double window thing, and then we're going to save a copy in our main size and then use image size to make it even smaller. So image size, that's one of its main functions, is to, its main function really, is to alter the size of what you have and what you can do with it. So let's go back to our original again. Because I opened this initially, this is just the way it came in. It's saying the pixel dimensions are 3246 by 4928. You can also view it in other measurements like, how does this relate to inches? So, for example, let's say now we were concerned with printing this on our inkjet printer. Well, I want to figure out how big can I print this on my inkjet without losing quality. Right now, it's telling me, in theory, I could print a 16 by 24, let's just round it off, but assuming that my resolution is 200 pixels per inch. Well, as I mentioned before, on my inkjet printer, I like to at least have 240. So how do I figure out how big a file size I can print? In this case, I do not want to resample. Resample means decrease the file size. In this case, I want the file size to stay the same. I want to alter these numbers. So if I uncheck resample image, that means now you'll see all these three numbers are linked together. So if I change any one of these factors, they will all change. So for example, on my inkjet, I want 240, so that tells me the biggest size I can print is 13 by 20, which is pretty good because a 13 by 19 is the big size I can print on my inkjet printer. So that means this is a big enough file. But let's pause for a second and look at this. Look at it the other way around. In order to be able to print a 13 by 19 at 240, I needed 46 megabytes worth of information. So if the only photograph that I have is 10 megabytes, well, guess what? You can't print a 13 by 19 at 240. So there's a couple of different ways of calculating what you can do. We can use that new dialog box to kind of figure out how big a file do I need, or you can open a file, look at image size and say, well, this is how much information I have. Let me massage those numbers a little bit to say, if I change the resolution to this, what will that allow me to do in terms of size? So the part that usually throws people off a little bit is this resample button. So let's go back to this for a second. Anytime you've been playing around in a dialog box in Photoshop and you want to kind of reset something, see where it says cancel here? If I hold down Option or Alt, cancel changes to reset, and I can put things back the way they were. So at first, usually, it comes in looking like this, saying resample, whatever method, in this case automatic, and these are the original numbers. So here's how you make the decision. If you have a large file and you wish to make it smaller, and you're going to ultimately probably make a copy of it, then you have resample checked because you're saying, I want you to readjust this to make it a smaller size, either by changing the pixel dimensions. That's usually the most common way. So let's say I want to make this 3,000 pixels high. Now it's saying, well, I'll fill in the width for you, and now the image size saying I was 46, now I'm 17. So clicking this resample or keeping it checked means I want to decrease the size of the image size, the number of pixel information, megabytes, is smaller than it was before. Now, let's reset that again. If, on the other hand, I decided, well, they told me that in order to print this humongous canvas, I need it to be 5,000 pixels wide. Well, now this is a very different scenario because now it's saying, well, it was 46 megabytes, now it's 108. So this is what I was talking about before when I said you don't really want to resize something bigger than the original, because in this case what's going to happen is that's more than double the size it originally was. But whenever I increase the size that dramatically, Photoshop does this thing called interpolation, which is a fancy word for saying invent pixel information to try and fill it in and make it look okay. But if I was to click OK to this, it will do its math, and I think you'll find that what's going to happen is, while technically now it's the right size, it's not going to look very good. So if I go to 100% size, it's not bad, but the quality is not as good. And honestly, this is actually better than it was a few versions ago of Photoshop, but technically this quality is still not as high. So when someone's asked the question, can I make this image bigger? The answer really is, well, technically, yes, you can go into image size and tell it to be larger. But should you is probably a better question, because in a pinch, if that's all you've got, then it will be okay. But as we said before, starting large and getting smaller, that's going to serve you much better. So let's look at a typical kind of a situation. We've got someone sends us a file, and we'll just say it's this one here. I have no idea about any information except the name of the file is small camera JPEG. Okay, let's check it out. Wow, that is small. I mean, the fact when it opened up, the first thing I did was looked up here and said 100%. That means this is really small. Let's see how small it is. Yep, it's in inches, but even if we put it in, well, you can see up here, it's only 200 pixels by 150. Now, if that was going to be a little tiny graphic on a website, great, no problem. But someone says, no, we need to print that an 8 by 10. Oh, you do you? Well, let's just see what will happen. In this case, I need to tell it, guess what? It needs to be much, much bigger. It needs to be not 0.66 inches, but 10 inches. And now it's saying, well, I was 87K, now I'm 19 megabytes. And again, in Photoshop CC, you can see it's giving you a preview to go, yeah, that's just not going to cut it. That's a hugely dramatic increase, and no matter how much the software is increased, that's such a large increase that that's probably not going to serve you very well at all. So what do you do in a case like that? Well, in all seriousness, the first thing I would do is say to the person who sent you that, do you have a bigger one? Send me the biggest one you got, because you're going to be better served by having more pixel information. So I happen to have a bigger one, and right away it looks more promising because in fit and screen view it's still only 25. So now I go to image size to see what do I really have. Okay, I've got tons of information, so I can actually go to an 8 by 10 without any problem. And that's just to, again, illustrate the difference between having enough information and not having enough information. So what we've been talking about right now, up until now, is changing the image size by saying, look at the dimensions that are already there and just massage those numbers up or down, which is quite different than things like cropping, which we'll talk about separately, because cropping is saying I want to cut out part of the image to only display a different area. Now, the other way that we can resize things in Photoshop, which is a little bit different, is to say I want to keep everything else the way it is in terms of when we look at image size. I still want it to be 2816 by 2112 or whatever it is. I want 17 megabytes worth of information, but I want to actually scale down the graphic within this size. And that's different. Image size means massage the overall pixel information. The next thing I want to talk about is how do you resize within a document, and it's by transforming. So let's do it this way. I'm going to make a new document, and we're going to say this is something I'm doing for maybe a video. So it's 1280 by 720 is the size. I don't really need to worry about the resolution as much. Click OK. So there's the size that I want. So when I go to image size, it's still saying, okay, it's 2.64 megabytes, not really that important. It's 1280 by 720, which is important. And in case you really want to know, it shows you the inches, but that's not important either. Now, I take this large camera, and I'm going to drag and drop it onto my image. And it's much, much bigger because it was coming from a bigger file, so I can't even see the whole thing. So one of the things you'll find that often happens, and we talked about this a little bit when we talked about the difference between opening and dragging over and placing, that because I just dragged this over, it's brought it in as its full size. Of course, I could move it around, but what I really want to do is free transform. Now, whenever you do free transform, that's going to put transformation handles on the outside of however big this is. Well, because this is so big, one of the tricks you learn fairly quickly in Photoshop is free transform, and then almost immediately, if not immediately, go change your view to fit on screen. That way you can see where the handles are. Now, when you're transforming something with free transform, it's important to note a couple of things. By default, it's not proportional. That's really important. You would almost expect it would be. I would think that you would think most of the time when you want to transform something smaller, you want it to keep its proportions. But in Photoshop, that doesn't happen. You have to hold down the Shift key, and when you drag one corner towards the other one, it scales it down in proportion. But if you wanted to, not that we would in this case, you can also go to a corner and kind of squish things, or go to just one corner and you can see it's not in proportion. So I'm going to escape out of that and hit free transform again. One of the other shortcuts that you'll find, I think, very useful when you're doing this kind of resizing and transformation is the Shift key is going to keep it proportion, but you'll see it's only going from the top right corner towards the bottom left corner, which would mean if I wanted to resize this to fit this image, I'd have to drag this corner and then come down here and drag this corner, which would work, but frankly it's a lot easier to throw in a different key. So the Shift key is going to keep it proportion. The Option or Alt key is going to scale towards the center, that little reference point in the center. So I'm holding down two keys, Shift and Option or Alt. Now, in one motion, I can just drag towards the center and say, yes, I want that to be this big. Now, when I fit in my window view, now I've got this layer that I can play with, but it's important to remember that the image size didn't change because the canvas, if you will, in which I was placing or dragging in this photo of the photograph, the photograph of the camera, that part hasn't changed. It's still 1280 by 720. But whenever you bring over image from a bigger file, it's going to be way too big, and when you free transform down, you're going to be scaling it down to fit. And just like when we talked about scaling the document size itself, the same theory applies to free transform. It's much better, you're going to get a much better quality to transform something down to a smaller size than to try and make something bigger by transforming it up. Let's compare. If we find our small little camera and drag it into this file, it's really small. And if I attempt to scale this up to make it the same relative size, more or less, you can see, yeah, not even close. So again, this is to stress the same point, and because I don't want you to fall in the trap where someone says, "We'll just make it bigger." Well, you have to be careful about making things bigger, because when you make things larger, either through image size for the overall image or on a layer by layer basis with free transformation, you're going to lose some quality. Again, if you're transforming up just a little bit, maybe it's not so important, but in a case like this, you can see quite clearly, look at the difference again between them. That's a huge difference in quality. I would not be very happy with that. The only thing that I might consider doing is if I was going to take this graphic and make it so faded out I could barely see it, and then put something else over the top of it. In a pinch, maybe that would work, but realistically, not so much. So when you have the choice, think about your end result and think, well, I want to end up with a camera that looks this big on this size of file, but I want to make sure I don't lose any quality, so I want to bring it in big enough to make sure it works. So the same theory is going to apply regardless. Either way, it's always the same. So the functions we're going to spend the most of our time with, for now, image size is the one where we're overall adjusting the image, as it says, the size of the image. And again, remember, you have to decide, do I want to resample it down to say I need a smaller size for some purpose? Or am I saying I actually need to readjust these numbers to change the resolution, to say, well, for example, if I was going to print this on my inkjet, I still want to know what's the best I can do, so I'm going to uncheck resample, put in 240 pixels per inch, and that's going to do the math for me and tell me it's approximately 12 by 9. I mean, obviously it's not quite exactly that, but that's kind of how we use this math. Okay? When you do this, when you uncheck resample and massage these numbers, you should not expect anything to happen visually. And this is, let's go back a step and show you what I mean. Let's use, well, I guess we can still use the same one, but I just want to clear out some of this other information that's distracting me. I don't know about you, but it's distracting me. And since I'm the one at the controls here, guess what? I'm going to make it happen. Come on. Okay, there we go. All right, so this one is, it's telling me, okay, it's 25%. I'm going to do fit in window view, and it's saying 27.4%. Okay, so we go to image size, and the first scenario, I decide, yes, I do want it smaller. I want it to be, instead of 9 inches, I want it to be 6 inches, and then it tells me the pixel dimensions. Anytime you see, again, in brackets, was, and then this number is smaller, that means it's going to reduce the size. So when I click OK, you'll see even on the screen, it's scaled it down. When I go to fit on screen, now that percentage has changed. So that's whenever you're resampling to make it smaller, even on the screen, you'll notice a visual change. If I go back and make it even more obvious and say I want it 2 inches, really, really small, now when I go to fit on screen, it's actually bigger than 100%. So I would go Command or Control 1 for 100%, and you can see that's how big it's going to be. So that's what happens when you resample. You're going to see a visual difference on the screen. Let's revert this. Go back to fit on screen, and once again go back to image size. But in this scenario, now I'm saying I want to see how big I can print it on my inkjet. So I hit resample image, and I type in, let's for the sake of argument do 225, just so you'll see it's a more obvious change. So now it's saying I can do 12 by 9-ish, but here's the key thing up at the top, this number doesn't change. So when I click OK, nothing happens. I mean, it actually did happen, but visually nothing happens. And that's important because I see people do that and they go to change something and think, why did nothing change? Well, actually it did, but it changed behind the scenes in the numbers so that when I print, it will now be the correct resolution for printing on my inkjet. But visually, nothing changed because it's still the same file size. It's still 17 megabytes worth of information. I've just massaged the numbers to make it print differently. So when you have resample checked. You should see something happen visually on the screen where when you click OK, it will either look smaller or bigger or something will happen to the display on your screen. When you choose to not resample, just reorganize the pixels, nothing will happen visually. And that's one of the factors that often throws people off because they are expecting something to change. The only time you'll see something change is when you resample it down to a smaller size. Okay, so let's go through another example here. I have a photograph that I previously worked on. It's a JPEG, so that means it's not a RAW file. I don't have the RAW right here in front of me. I mean, I actually do, but for the sake of argument, I'm going to say I don't. So this is kind of the workflow I would go through to kind of figure it out. I would open it up, and the first thing I do is go to image size. Now, as I mentioned, this is a personal preference, but even if you're not currently a big keyboard shortcut kind of person, I find I spend an awful lot of time going into image size. So it was one of those keyboard shortcuts I learned relatively quickly because instead of always going image size, Command Option I or Control Alt I just became, I don't know, one of those shortcuts that I learned fairly quickly. Okay, so back to our story here. I open this file and it's telling me all the information. Its image size is 7.33 megabytes. This is the dimensions and this is where it's currently set just because previously I had resample turned off. So this tells me I have 7.33 megabytes worth of information, or on my inkjet I could print at about a 5 by 8 at 240. So here's the other way to look at it. What if you say, but gosh, I really need this to be an 8 by 10. So I type in 8 and it says, well, I can do an 8 by 12 if I resample it up, but that means it's doing the math, and again in CC you can see the quality's not the greatest. So that's telling it I need you to invent information. So the other option would be to say, okay, well let's see what happens if this, so this is what I just had. I had resample turned on and I made this 8 and it made this image size bigger. Let's say, what if I don't want you to resample? I want to see the best I can get to. So if I put a width of 8, it says, well, if you want to print an 8 by 12, because that's the dimensions of this photo, the best I can do is 160.125. Is that enough? Well, guess what? The answer is, it depends. It depends on the image, it depends on your printer. While 240 would be my preferred resolution, 160 is not horrible. It might not be quite as good. But just to put this in some perspective, it's all a matter of degree. Years ago, I did a little experiment and I took a photograph and I made, I want to say, 5 different prints. 300, 250, 200, 150, 100, I think was the lowest. And I expected 100 to be horrible because that was effectively screen resolution. But the funny thing was, when I printed them out, and I actually write on the back of them which one was which, and laid them out, it was a subtle difference. Now certainly between 100 and 300 there was a bit of a difference, but honestly after 150 it was pretty hard to tell the difference. It was pretty subtle. And certainly, like some of my friends who were in the printing business, they were getting out a loop. I'm like, well, that's cheating, because you wouldn't look at a print on a wall. Well, maybe you would, but I wouldn't look at it with a little loop and go, I can see the difference. So when we held them up as if they were in a frame, no one could really tell the difference. So what I'm saying is that some of these numbers, like when I say establish a good number for your inkjet, that means in an ideal world, you would have this number. But personally, my preference would be, given the choice between resampling it up to make it 240 and therefore artificially inventing new pixels, or doing it this way that I just showed you and saying, don't resample it, just alter the numbers, and as long as I end up with something that's 150 or higher, I'd rather try that. Now, the purists might say, no, you definitely need 240. Well, guess what? Sometimes we don't have it. And remember, all of this discussion is based on what we're starting with. In this particular example, I'm pretending, because I really do have the original RAW file, that this is all I got. So if that's all you have to work with, you have to figure out what's the best you can do. And my personal preference would be, again, I'd rather print this one at 160 than push it up to 240 and risk artificially changing the pixels. Now, as we saw here in this example, Photoshop CC, this is one of its nicer new features, is the fact that I can make this image size command much bigger. And now if I do want to compare, let's go back and reset this. And what if I said, you know what, let's actually push this up, resample it. So I'm going to put this 8. Now, it's not horrible, but I don't know, I'm just not convinced. I think I would probably, in this case, say, you know what, let's just tell it that we don't want to resample. And of course, I was doing it the wrong way. It should have been 10 this way. So now, okay, now let me retract my statement a little bit. 128, maybe not quite as good. So what I might do in this case, and I apologize that I didn't do this right the first time. Actually, I'm sorry, I am right. Oh boy, that was a really good demonstration because I realized I was not seeing the entire image. If I zoomed out, it would remind me that it actually is a tall image. Just when I zoomed in like this, I was thinking it was wide for a second. But let's continue with this scenario since I went down this path. If I did this and went, gosh, it's only 128, then what I might do is this. I would say, okay, well, let's pretend I actually wanted a 10 by 15 and the math said 128. I would click OK. Then I would go back to image size and resample it, but I'd only resample it up a little bit, like 150. So now I'm going from 7 megabytes to 10, which is not asking Photoshop to invent a huge amount of pixel information. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing image size in a couple of steps. First, turn resample off and massage the numbers, massage the numbers, do whatever you need to make the numbers close to what you want, and then go back, turn resample on, but we're pushing it up just a little notch, not a huge amount. So again, just to stress the point, you want to artificially resize as minimally as possible. And to stress the other couple of main points in this lesson, if you do start with a really large file, don't let Photoshop fool you into zooming into 100%, doing all this tiny detail work. Remember our little technique of doing that two-window kind of things? I think that will serve you a lot. Now, interestingly, what I found is at first I was always doing that dual window thing so I wouldn't forget, and now over time I just in my head remind myself I don't need to worry about every little tiny detail because it's going to end up being smaller. But initially, at least, doing that dual window thing is a whole lot easier. So here's what I suggest you want to do to kind of experiment with your assignment, if you will, is to, if you have a Camera Raw file, open it in its largest possible size. Then find some other file you have that's quite small in terms of image size and open that as well. And then just spend a few minutes just experimenting with what happens if I turn resample on or off. If you see that file size getting bigger, that means Photoshop is inventing information, and for the most part, you'll probably see a loss in quality. And the more you do that, then it'll start putting in perspective, so you know, and this is why I always make this point, better to be too big than too small. So if you have a large file, I'd rather have a file that's large that I can scale down than the other way around. So just spend a bit of time playing around with image size, and we'll see you tomorrow. Well, yesterday we talked about image size and how important it is when you're resizing the overall image, when you want to keep the same pixels in the image but make it bigger or smaller. That's what image size does. Today we're going to talk about something similar but frankly quite different, and that's cropping. And cropping means removing part of the image. So we're actually going to take pixels away, either permanently or hopefully in some cases in a non-destructive way. So one of the options we have now as of the last couple of versions of Photoshop and through Camera Raw is non-destructive cropping. Now honestly, that's a term I never thought I would even have said up until recently, because cropping was a very destructive thing. It was about as destructive as it got, because once you cropped and saved, that was your new image and information was thrown away. But thanks to changes to both the crop tool and also the ability to crop in Camera Raw, we now have a much more, at least the option of being non-destructive. Now, like in many things, it will depend on the situation. If you are taking a photograph and when you look through the viewfinder, you like the composition of something, but then when you open it in Photoshop, you realize you could have been a little tighter, there might not be any reason to preserve the original information, especially if you realize there's a tree on the side that's kind of distracting, then you may just decide to just crop it and save it and move on from there. However, especially if you shoot RAW, you're going to still keep the original anyway, so you always have that backup. Even if you're opening a copy from RAW and ending up in JPEG, at least the RAW has that option. But we're going to talk about the two different ways to do things, and then some of the lots of different ways we can take advantage of cropping. Cropping does really one main thing, and as a little side bonus, something else. The main thing is removing information. The side bonus is it can also straighten things a bit and potentially can even add more canvas information if we need it. So let's take a look at this example. Now, actually, before we take a look, at this, I do want to add that there has been a significant change as of Photoshop CS6. So if you've been using an older version previous to that and now are either in Photoshop CS6 or CC, you will notice some significant changes to the way that the crop tool works, because in the past there was a very specific way that it worked, and a lot of people, when CS6 came out with the new improved crop tool, frankly weren't all that happy with the way it operated. But I think that's because it was just different, because honestly, once you get used to it, I think the way that the crop tool works now makes better sense. It's more intuitive and you get a much more visual preview than you used to in the past. So if you're brand new to the crop tool, there is a way in Photoshop CS6 or CC that you can kind of return to what they call classic mode, which is the way it used to work. I would strongly recommend you resist the temptation to enable that and stick with the way the crop tool works. Even at first you find it frustrating and different. I am so much happier now with the crop tool now than the way it used to be. Because honestly, in the past, the crop tool used to take a bit of imagination to kind of hope you could imagine what you were going to get when you cropped it. Now it's very, very visual. So let's take a look here. First important difference is when I click on the crop tool, in the past, I would have had to click and drag to indicate an area that I wanted to crop. Here, the crop handles are already on. If I want to crop it, I can just drag the handle and you'll see now it's showing me the crop area. But I'm going to escape out of that for a second, and before we talk about that, let's look at this very important option up in the options bar, which is delete cropped pixels. Up until the last couple of versions of Photoshop, this was a lot more hidden. There was a way to do it, but it was really a lot more challenging. Even though this came in as a locked background layer, as soon as I click on the crop tool, in effect, it's unlocked it, and now I have this option. So if I were to drag this and say, this is the way I want this new image to look, and I commit it by either pressing the check mark or hitting enter or return, if I were to save this and close it, that would be my new photograph. The other pixels would be gone. So the image size would be different, but also, more importantly, I've removed information from this image. So if we undo that, if I uncheck this, this is the way we can do non-destructive cropping. I can still click and drag if I want to say this is the area I want. I get this nice preview, which we'll talk about all those options later. But this time, when I commit it, the difference is, even though I could close and save this, that information is still there because it's not deleted. And the way we get it back is if you later on realize maybe I should not have cropped this, I go to the image menu to reveal all, and then it will bring back all the information that was cropped. Now that's only an option if you have this turned off. So like a lot of things in Photoshop, you just have to decide, should I have this checked or not? And the decision will be based on the likelihood you want to change your mind. That's a personal preference. Now we'll come back and talk about a lot of these other things, but let's look at the other way that we can do non-destructive cropping, and that's through Camera Raw. So first of all, I need to reset this just to show you what it normally looks like. Okay, so here's my Camera Raw file. I open it in RAW, in Camera Raw, and there's sets of options for the crop tool. You can just do normal, which means click and drag any shape you want, or certain ratios. So if you know you want to fit an 8x10, you could do a 4x5 ratio, and so on. We're not going to go through all the options in here right at the moment. The main thing I want to show you in here is if I click and drag to say I want to crop like this, I still have, and I leave this on all the time, this option called Open Object, which is this one we talked about and we'll continue to talk about, Open in Photoshop as Smart Object. So now I hit Open Object, it comes into Photoshop and appears as though that information is gone, but really it's just this is the version that I've opened. If we switch back to Bridge for a second, you'll see even the preview updates to show me something has changed, but the indicator is this little crop symbol means you're viewing the last way you left this raw file, which is with this crop in place. But thankfully, we can get it back, get that information back. So if I have this image here and I'm working on it, I can even do things to it in Photoshop, but just for the sake of argument, I'll show you that I look at this suddenly go, yeah, maybe I didn't really want to crop that after all. I double click to go back to Camera Raw. As soon as I click on the crop tool, it shows me, well, here's the crop you have. So by nature, the Camera Raw method of cropping is non-destructive. I didn't have to do anything to say reveal all. All I'm doing is telling it, show me what you've got, and I can then go back to this menu and just choose clear the crop. Now I click OK. Now what's going to happen at first, it might look like nothing has happened. But what it's really done is revealed all those pixels, but because the canvas size that I was working on was this size, now once again I have to go back to Image and choose Reveal All, and now I see the rest of my photograph. So two different choices there. The crop tool has the option within Photoshop to delete crop pixels or not. Camera Raw by nature is a non-destructive crop, so that gives you both choices. And again, you might not always want to crop something every time. I don't always, and as much as I am pushed for working non-destructively, you know, honestly, there'll be times where you just don't need to. If you take that photograph and realize there's information on the side that is kind of distracting and you just never want to see it again, you crop it, save it as a JPEG, and you're good to go, knowing that that raw file is in the background, keeping that original as shot photo. And that's one of the, again, the benefits of RAW is that you can't overwrite the original like you can with JPEGs. So here, let's look through some of the things. Now I mentioned in an earlier lesson, I'll keep stressing this, as soon as I click on a tool, my eyes go up to the options bar to see is there anything that I need to change in terms of settings. And in here, there's a few, like this a bunch of different overlays, which means as soon as I start to crop, I'll get an overlay that will help me. So for example, right now it's set to grid. So as soon as I start to drag, you'll see this grid shows up, and that can help for things like straightening. I can also choose that I want rule of thirds. So if I'm trying to use the rule of thirds in my composition to decide where should I have important information, like the line of horizon or something like that. And there's all these different ones, and you can even cycle through them by pressing the letter O if it helps to have these different grids, or you can just choose not to have a grid at all, of course. But I find, especially if you're trying to straighten something, having the grid on there can be quite useful. So that's what these options under this menu is all about. This is where we have overall settings, and here's this one, don't use it, please, please, please don't use it. No, I'm just kidding, obviously you can, but use classic mode means go back to the way Photoshop Crop Tool used to work, and I personally, I find that not as useful anymore. Auto Center Preview means when I'm cropping, it's always, see how it's moving the photograph around inside my crop area, which actually is, again, different than it used to be. It used to be you would drag the crop and then have to reposition the crop area, but here you can actually move the photograph around to decide where you want it to go. So again, once you get used to this new idea, I think this makes a lot better sense to say, this is my crop, I'm kind of dimming the outside area to help me figure out what's going on and what the area, and as I make any adjustment, it's going to redo that little preview kind of overlay idea. and this is where it's actually called the crop shield, and you have different options. You can, right now it's matching my canvas color. I could also go in and decide I really want it to be black or anything you want. Let's put it back to kind of a grayish color, and what opacity is. And what that means is if you don't have that on, then you see the crop handles and there's no difference to the photograph. Personally, I like having this shield on because it helps me kind of preview what the cropped photograph will look like. Some people like to put this all the way up to 100% opacity so they're not seeing anything of the original photograph. I like to have mine somewhere in the most, like kind of seeing it, but it helps me picture the result that I'm getting. So like a lot of tool settings, these ones will stay the way that you leave them. So if you decide this is what the way you want it to use these options, it will stay that way until you tell it otherwise. So we have lots of options here. Do you want to show the outside area or not? All that kind of stuff. Personally, I have it set like this, and again, you have, nothing is cropped until you either confirm it or cancel it. Now, even in the middle of doing this, at this point, I can still be right in the middle of cropping and say, I think I'm going to crop it this way, and still decide, do I want to delete or not? So that's an ongoing choice that you have. If you decide that you're in the middle of cropping and you just want to forget it and start over again, you have a couple of choices. You could click this cancel button or press the escape key on your keyboard, and either way it will escape out. We're still in the crop tool and it still has handles here ready to be cropped, but it's letting us start over again. So if we want to make new adjustments to how we crop. Now we'll come back to the crop tool in a second, but I want to talk about a couple of other things first, and that is whenever you crop in Photoshop, ultimately it's still going to always crop to a rectangular image. And what I mean by that is, let's say that I make some weird shape of a selection in here, and let's feather that edge of my selection so I have a really soft edge selection. I'm going to duplicate that, Command and Control J, and then hide the background. Now, if I say, well, gosh, what I'd really like to do is crop it to that shape, so all I see is that, that's not going to happen, because if I make this into a selection, even though I've got a selection now, there is a command that we'll talk about as we go here under image called crop, but you'll see it'll crop as closely as it can based on the fact that this has soft edges. So even though in my mind I'm thinking I want to crop this to a shape, it won't happen. It's going to always be rectangular, even if some of that rectangle has to be transparent pixels. Let me do that a different way just so you can see it another way. This time we'll just make an oval selection and go to the image menu and choose crop, and it says, well, I will crop it as tightly as I can to the oval. So it's always going to be a rectangle. Now if you chose to make these areas see-through and save as a PNG file or something, that would be different. But from a cropping perspective, it's always going to crop it based on a rectangle that's just big enough to encompass whatever shape you've had. So as an example, I can't honestly say I've done this all that often, but one theory would be to say I want to crop into this area and down to this area, and I just made two selections. So now when I go to crop, it's going to crop it again within those two areas that I selected. So plenty of ways to do it. This crop command under the image menu is based on having a selection. So some people who, for whatever reason, they just don't go to the crop tool, this works too. It's completely up to you, with one important difference, and that is you can make a selection and then use the command transform selection to decide what area you want to crop, hit enter to finalize the selection, and then go to image crop. But you'll notice in here there is no option that says whether to delete the pixels or not. So this by nature is a permanent crop. There's no option like there is in the crop tool. So that's where this one, the main difference is that you would only use this command if you really were certain that you wanted to delete the pixels. So the crop tool is the only one that has this delete cropped pixels option in it. Otherwise, let's say, for the sake of argument, that we're going to make a new document and we'll bring something into it. And I'm going to transform this layer down so there's some area around the outside, and I'm going to hide the background layer. So as you can see right now, I have that layer transparency. Well, let's assume for a moment that having done that, now what I really want to do is crop it so that I see just the photograph. Well, instead of having to go to any effort of selecting it or using the crop tool, one of the nice features that Photoshop has is if you have a situation like this where there's extra information, it could be transparent, it could be white, and we'll see these examples in a second. You go to the image menu and choose trim. Now notice how crop is grayed out because I don't have a selection, so I go to trim and it says how would you like to trim this, and I say based on the transparent pixels, trim away top, bottom, left, right. So when I click OK, now it automatically crops it to that size. If I undo that, and if I had the background showing, then I could do the same thing, image, trim, but in this case it's automatically assuming, because it doesn't see any transparent pixels, I want to base it on the top left pixel color, which in this case would be white, and then when I click OK, it removes everything. So this is very useful for situations where maybe you are working on a project like this and you have files that are different sizes, or you scan something in and there's a bit of a white border around the outside. Rather than go to any effort to crop it yourself, the trim command will do it automatically, and you have those three choices: trim based on transparency, based on the top left pixel, or a specific color. So if it was on a red background, you could sample that color of red and say trim that. Now don't be surprised if you use the trim command and you see just a tiny hair fringe of a border, because sometimes it's so pixel specific it might miss by a little bit just based on a slight color difference. It doesn't happen as much with transparency. So you always have the option of, even back here in this case, I could say, well, just to be sure, I'm going to take the crop tool and just move the handles myself and make them line up with my image and then crop it that way. And this has the added bonus where, again, I have the delete cropped pixels option or not. So that's always another choice. So anytime, multiple different options as to how you do the actual cropping. Now, when you have, let's close this and just go back to our original image, this one here. So I'm open this photo. The first thing I would do is go to image size. We talked about the last class to see what I have to work with. It's telling me it's 9 by 6 at 200. It's a 6.21 megabyte file. Just wanted to know what that was. So basically 6.2 megabytes. If I do decide to take my crop tool and I decide that I'm going to crop it to look more like this, and I hit enter, now if I go back to the image size, it's smaller because I've thrown away information. So at this point, now I could go and do the things we talked about in the last class about working with dimensions and all that kind of stuff, but we're doing it on top of cropping. So it's important to note that when you crop something, you're still ultimately affecting the image size, but you're not just keeping it in the same proportions. You're actually, those numbers will change. So if it was 1280 by 720, now it might be 1000 by 600, because we've taken that crop tool and determined this is the area that I want to keep. So when you hit enter, it will both change the overall dimensions of the image and also throw away some pixel information. So that's where